The small hand clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted from years of tears and tight embraces. Eliza Winters sat by the window of her aunt's modest two-bedroom house, watching raindrops race down the glass. At 12 years old, she was small for her age, with dark hair that fell in untamed waves around a pale face dominated by large, expressive brown eyes. Those eyes spoke volumes because her voice did not. Eliza hadn't spoken a single word in 9 years. Not since that rainy evening when she was 3, strapped in her car seat watching her parents argue in the front. Not since the blinding headlights came toward them on the wrong side of the road. Not since the crushing sound of metal and the sudden silence that followed. The doctor said there was nothing physically wrong with her voice. They called it selective mutism brought on by severe trauma. Big words that meant her silence was a fortress she'd built around herself. Brick by brick, to keep the world's pain at bay. Aunt Margaret never pushed her to speak. On the day she took Eliza home from the hospital, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she signed guardianship papers, she'd simply said, "You'll talk when you're ready, little bird. And if that day never comes, we'll find other ways." They had found other ways. A small whiteboard hung around Eliza's neck during school hours. A notebook with a purple pen attached by a string sat on her bedside table. Hand gestures, facial expressions, and the occasional drawing filled the gaps. But mostly it was her eyes, windows to thoughts too complex for any whiteboard. "Lunchtime, Eliza," Aunt Margaret called from the kitchen. "I've made your favorite sandwich." Eliza slid from the window seat, her socked feet silent on the wooden floor. The house always smelled like cinnamon and old books. Aunt Margaret was a high school literature teacher who believed every surface was improved by the addition of a book or a potted plant. Today, the kitchen counter held both. A worn copy of Anne of Green Gables and a small basil plant growing in a blue ceramic pot. The sandwich waiting on the table was peanut butter and sliced bananas on wheat bread, cut into 4 perfect triangles. Comfort food. Eliza wondered what bad news was coming. Adults always made favorite foods before bad news. She slid into her chair and raised an eyebrow at her aunt. "Don't give me that look," Aunt Margaret said, her lined face breaking into a smile. "Can't I make your favorite lunch without an interrogation from those eyes of yours?" Eliza allowed herself a small smile and picked up a sandwich triangle. "Actually," her aunt continued, sitting across from her with a cup of tea, "Mrs. Patel called from school today." Eliza's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Mrs. Patel was the school counselor. Meetings with her meant uncomfortable questions and sad, pitying looks. No, it's nothing bad," Aunt Margaret hurried to add. "She mentioned you've been spending lunchtimes in the music room." Eliza looked down at her plate. She'd hoped no one had noticed. The music room was supposed to be locked during lunch, but Mr. Chen, the elderly janitor, had seen her peering through the small window one day and silently unlocked it for her. He never said a word about it, just nodded and walked away. Every day since, the door had been mysteriously unlocked between 12:10 and 12:50. "Mrs. Patel thought you might be hiding from the other kids," Aunt Margaret said carefully. "But I told her that didn't sound like you. You don't hide, Eliza, you observe. It was true." Eliza didn't fear the other 7th graders with their loud voices and complicated social rules. She simply found them exhausting. All that talking, saying so little. In the music room, with its neat rows of instruments and the smell of wood polish and valve oil, she could just be. Eliza reached for her small whiteboard and uncapped the marker. "I like the quiet," she wrote. "I know you do, little bird." Aunt Margaret took a sip of her tea. Mrs. Patel also mentioned something else. She said Mr. Rivera caught you playing the piano yesterday. Heat rushed to Eliza's cheeks. Mr. Rivera was the music teacher, a young man with kind eyes and a voice like warm honey. She'd thought the room was empty when she'd dared to press a few keys, testing how they felt under her fingertips. He said, "You have a natural ear." Aunt Margaret's voice was casual, but her eyes were watching carefully. "He asked if you'd ever had lessons." Eliza shook her head. The old upright piano that had once sat in the corner of their living room was sold years ago when money got tight after Aunt Margaret's hours were cut. Eliza had been 6 then, and while she remembered the weight of the keys beneath her small fingers, she'd never had proper lessons. "Am I in trouble?" Eliza wrote on her board. "Goodness, no." Aunt Margaret laughed. "Quite the opposite. Mr. Rivera would like to offer you piano lessons. After school, twice a week." Eliza's eyes widened. Her heart began to race, a feeling both scary and exciting flooding her chest. She quickly wiped her board and wrote, "We can't afford it." Aunt Margaret reached across the table and took Eliza's small hand in her weathered one. "Mr. Rivera doesn't want payment. He says he has a scholarship fund for promising students, and he thinks you're very promising." Eliza frowned. She'd learned early that nothing in life was truly free. Everything came with expectations attached. If she took these lessons, Mr. Rivera would expect her to perform someday, to sit on a stage with eyes watching. The thought made her stomach twist. As if reading her mind, Aunt Margaret squeezed her hand. "You wouldn't have to perform. Not if you don't want to."
"This would be just for you, Eliza. A way to express what's inside." Eliza pulled her hand away and wrote, "I don't need to express anything. Everyone needs to express themselves."
"Little bird," Aunt Margaret's voice was soft, "even if it's just to themselves." That night, Eliza lay in bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to her ceiling. They were faded now, barely giving off any light, but she knew each one by heart. Her father had put them there in the old house, telling her stories about constellations as he worked. Aunt Margaret had carefully removed them when they sold that house and reapplied them here, in the exact same pattern. School the next day felt longer than usual. Eliza moved through the hallways like a ghost, as she always did, but today she felt the weight of a decision hanging over her. When the final bell rang, she found herself standing outside the music room door, her heart hammering. Mr. Rivera was arranging sheet music when she slipped in. He looked up and smiled, not seeming at all surprised to see her. "Hello, Eliza," he said, his voice as warm as she remembered. "Your aunt called me this morning. She said you might stop by." Eliza stood frozen by the door, suddenly unsure. The piano sat in the corner, its black surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It seemed to be waiting for her. Mr. Rivera didn't push or rush to fill the silence. He simply continued organizing his papers, giving her time. Finally, he said, "Would you like to try it again?" "No pressure, just exploration." Eliza took a small step forward, then another. The piano bench creaked slightly as she sat down. The keys looked different from this angle, not just black and white, but full of possibility. She placed her fingers on the cool surface, not pressing down, just feeling. Then slowly she pressed a single key, middle C, though she didn't know its name yet. The note hung in the air, pure and perfect. "Beautiful," Mr. Rivera said quietly. "Try another." She did, then another, creating a simple melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't a song she knew. It was something new, something that belonged only to her. When she finally looked up, Mr. Rivera was watching her with a gentle smile. "Music is another language, Eliza. Sometimes it says things words cannot." For the first time in a very long while, Eliza felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she hadn't even known was there began to unravel. Her fingers moved across the keys again, not making music exactly, but making something that felt like truth. That evening, when Aunt Margaret asked how her day had been, Eliza picked up her whiteboard and wrote just 2 words. "I'm ready." The piano lessons began the following Tuesday. Twice a week, Eliza stayed after school, learning notes and scales and fingering techniques. Mr. Rivera never asked her to speak. He demonstrated and she copied. He pointed, and she understood. "You have a gift," he told her after a month of lessons when she played a simple piece from memory. "But more importantly, you have heart. That's something I can't teach." At home, Eliza practiced on a keyboard Aunt Margaret had found at a thrift store. It wasn't the same as a real piano. The keys were lighter, the sound tinnier, but it was enough. She practiced until her fingers ached, then practiced more. The nightmares came less frequently now. When they did come, when she woke gasping and sweating from dreams of screeching tires and breaking glass, she would slip from her bed and turn on her keyboard, plugging in headphones so as not to wake her aunt. In the glow of her bedside lamp, her fingers would find the keys and the music would wash away the fear. Eliza still didn't speak. But for the first time since that rainy night 9 years ago, she had found a voice that felt like her own. 2 years passed like water flowing downstream, steady and unstoppable. Eliza's bedroom walls, once bare except for the faded glow-in-the-dark stars, now held posters of famous pianists and handwritten sheet music. The thrift store keyboard had been upgraded to a better one, still not a real piano, but with weighted keys that Mr. Rivera said would strengthen her fingers. At 14, Eliza remained silent, but her music spoke volumes. She'd progressed through beginner books at a pace that made Mr. Rivera's eyebrows raise higher each week. Now she was tackling pieces meant for students with years more experience, her small hands stretching across octaves, her mind memorizing complex patterns that her fingers then recreated effortlessly. "She's something special," Mr. Rivera told Aunt Margaret during their quarterly check-in. "I've taught for 15 years and I've never seen anyone pick it up quite like Eliza does." Aunt Margaret beamed with pride, but felt a twinge of sadness too. The piano had become Eliza's world, her solace, her passion, her voice, but it hadn't brought back her actual voice as Margaret had secretly hoped it might. "Do you think she'll ever—" Margaret couldn't finish the question. Mr. Rivera's kind eyes softened. "I don't know, but does it matter? She's communicating now more than ever before." It was true. Through music, Eliza expressed joy, sorrow, frustration, and love, all the emotions that had been locked inside her for so long. The piano had given her a language more nuanced than the scribbled words on her whiteboard could ever be. Eliza's 14th birthday fell on a Saturday in April. Spring had fully arrived, painting their small town in soft greens and bright splashes of flower colors. Margaret had asked what she wanted to do for her birthday, and for once Eliza had no immediate answer. In previous years, the day had always been marked by quiet celebrations at home, a special meal, a carefully chosen gift, maybe a movie. But 14 felt different somehow. Not quite grown up, but no longer a child either. After thinking about it for several days, Eliza finally wrote on her whiteboard, "I want to hear a real piano concert." This request sent Margaret into research mode. The nearest city with a proper concert hall was 2 hours away. She checked the schedule. Nothing suitable was playing that weekend. She considered asking Mr. Rivera if he knew of any performances, but before she could, an article in the local newspaper caught her eye. "Grand Piano Donation to Community Center," the headline read. The article explained that an elderly resident had donated her late husband's concert grand piano to the newly renovated community center. To celebrate, they were holding a small ceremony and had invited a pianist from the state university to give a short recital. "Eliza," Margaret called, excitement in her voice, "I think I found the perfect birthday outing for you." The day of the recital, Eliza dressed with unusual care. She chose her navy blue dress, the one saved for special occasions, and even let Margaret twist her dark hair into a neat braid. As they drove to the community center, Margaret noticed Eliza's hands moving slightly on her lap, practicing invisible keys. The community center was busy when they arrived. The renovation had just been completed, transforming the old, dingy building into a bright, welcoming space. People milled around the main hall, admiring the new paint and fixtures. In the corner stood the piano, massive, gleaming, and black as midnight. Eliza stopped in her tracks when she saw it. While her school's piano was upright and worn from years of student use, this was a grand piano with the lid propped open, revealing its complex inner workings like the anatomy of some magnificent beast. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret said, following her gaze. Eliza nodded, her eyes never leaving the instrument. As people began to take seats in the folding chairs arranged in front of the piano, Eliza and Margaret found spots near the middle. The community center director gave a short speech thanking the donor, Mrs. Livingston, a tiny woman with silver hair who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief when everyone applauded. Then the pianist was introduced, Professor Thomas from the State University. He was tall and thin with wiry gray hair that seemed to have a mind of its own. He bowed slightly to the audience before seating himself at the piano bench. The moment his fingers touched the keys, Eliza felt something inside her shift. The sound that filled the room was nothing like her keyboard at home or even the school piano. This was a living thing, rich and resonant, each note perfectly distinct yet blending into something greater than the sum of its parts. Professor Thomas played Chopin, the notes cascading like water over rocks, then gathering force like a storm before resolving into peaceful resolution. Eliza sat perfectly still, barely breathing. When the piece ended, she didn't join the applause immediately. She was still living inside the music, unwilling to let it go. After playing 3 more pieces, Professor Thomas stood and bowed again. "Thank you all for coming today. This magnificent instrument deserves to be played, not just admired. I hope it brings much joy to your community." As people began to disperse, heading toward the refreshment table where cookies and punch were being served, Eliza remained seated. Margaret, understanding her niece's reluctance to join the crowd, said, "I'll get us some punch. Wait here?" Eliza nodded, her eyes still on the piano. Now abandoned by its performer, it seemed both imposing and inviting. When Margaret was out of sight, Eliza stood and walked slowly toward it. No one was watching. The adults were all engaged in conversation, their backs to the performance area. She reached the piano and hesitantly touched its smooth surface. The wood was cool and polished under her fingertips. She glanced around once more to make sure no one was looking, then slid onto the bench. The keys felt different from any she had played before, more substantial, with a perfect resistance that seemed to meet her fingers halfway. Eliza placed her hands in position and very softly began to play. She chose a piece she knew by heart, one she had practiced countless times on her keyboard at home. But on this piano it transformed into something new. Each note rang with a clarity that made her heart race. She forgot where she was, forgot to be anxious about being watched. There was only the music flowing from some deep place inside her out through her fingertips. She didn't notice when people began to turn, drawn by the unexpected music. She didn't see Mrs. Livingston's eyes widen in surprise or Professor Thomas pause with his punch cup halfway to his lips. She didn't even notice when Aunt Margaret returned, standing frozen with 2 cups of punch in her hands. The piece ended, the final note hanging in the air like a question. Only then did Eliza become aware of the silence around her. She looked up to find a small crowd watching her, their faces showing varying degrees of surprise and admiration. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She stood quickly, nearly knocking over the bench, and looked for an escape route. "Wait," called a voice. Professor Thomas was making his way toward her, his tall frame moving through the crowd with purpose.
Young lady, that was remarkable. Eliza's eyes darted to Aunt Margaret, seeking rescue.
Margaret hurried over, setting down the punch cups on a nearby table. "I'm so sorry," Margaret began. "My niece didn't mean to." "No apologies necessary," Professor Thomas interrupted. "Not after playing like that." He turned to Eliza. "How long have you been studying?" Eliza froze, her hands instinctively reaching for the whiteboard that wasn't hanging around her neck today. Margaret stepped in. "About 2 years now. Her school music teacher gives her lessons." Professor Thomas's bushy eyebrows shot up. 2 years? That's... He shook his head in disbelief. "That's extraordinary. Most students wouldn't tackle that piece until at least 5 years of serious study." Mrs. Livingston had joined them now, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You played beautifully, dear. My Harold would have been so pleased to hear his piano sing again." Eliza managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing from the unexpected attention. Professor Thomas was looking at her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "Does she speak?" he asked Margaret, as if Eliza wasn't standing right there. Before Margaret could answer, Eliza took out her phone and opened her notes app. She typed quickly and held it up. "No, but I can hear you just fine." Professor Thomas had the good grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, forgive me." He addressed Eliza directly now. "Would you be interested in playing another piece? Something of your choice?" Eliza hesitated, then typed again. "I don't perform. I just play for myself." "I understand," he said, though his expression suggested he found it baffling that someone with her talent wouldn't want to share it. "But perhaps you'd consider something else. I teach advanced students at the university, but I also have a small private studio. I'd be honored to work with you if you're interested." Eliza's eyes widened. She looked at Aunt Margaret, who seemed equally shocked. "That's very generous," Margaret said carefully. "But we live quite far from the university, and I'm afraid lessons would be—" "We could arrange something," Professor Thomas said. "Perhaps once a month. And as for the cost," he waved his hand dismissively, "talent like hers shouldn't go unnurtured for lack of funds." That evening, as they drove home with the windows down and spring air rushing in, Eliza's mind raced faster than the passing landscape. She'd been given Professor Thomas's card, with his email and phone number. "Think about it," he had said. What she couldn't stop thinking about was the piano itself, how it had felt beneath her hands, how the notes had resonated not just in the room but inside her very bones. The keyboard at home would feel like a toy now. As if reading her thoughts, Aunt Margaret said, You know, the community center director mentioned that the piano would be available for people to use. They're going to set up a schedule. She glanced at Eliza. We could reserve time for you if you wanted. Eliza nodded, a smile spreading across her face. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility opening before her. Wide and deep and full of music yet to be played. Summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to winter. The community center piano became Eliza's sanctuary. Twice a week, Aunt Margaret would drive her there after school, wait patiently for 2 hours, then drive her home. On the first Saturday of each month, they made the longer journey to Professor Thomas's home studio, where Eliza's lessons took her music to heights that sometimes left her breathless. You're progressing at a remarkable rate, Professor Thomas told her during one such lesson. His home was filled with books and records, and the walls of his studio displayed framed concert programs from his performing days. But technique is only part of what makes a true musician. You must also find your own voice. Eliza glanced up at him, her eyes questioning. She'd been playing the same Beethoven sonata for weeks, perfecting each phrase, each transition. Professor Thomas sighed, running a hand through his wild gray hair. Don't misunderstand me. Your playing is technically brilliant, but I sense you're hiding behind the notes on the page. The composers give us a blueprint, yes, but we must bring ourselves to the music. He tapped his chest. From in here. That evening, as they drove home through early December darkness, Aunt Margaret noticed Eliza's unusual quiet. Not her normal silence, but something more pensive, her forehead pressed against the cold car window, breath fogging the glass. Everything okay with Professor Thomas? She asked. Eliza pulled out her phone and typed quickly. He says I need to find my voice. Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. And what do you think about that? Eliza typed again. I don't know what my voice sounds like anymore. The confession hung in the car, more revealing than anything Eliza had communicated in years. Margaret swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Maybe, she said carefully. That's something worth discovering. The next day, instead of practicing her assigned pieces, Eliza sat at the keyboard in her room and just let her fingers wander. No sheet music, no structure, just pure improvisation. At first it felt wrong, like speaking nonsense when asked to recite poetry. But gradually something began to emerge, a melody she'd never heard before, born from some hidden place inside her. When Aunt Margaret came to call her for dinner, she found Eliza lost in this new world, tears streaming down her face though she didn't seem to notice them. Margaret stood silently in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. The music Eliza played wasn't polished or perfect like her usual practice sessions. It was raw, sometimes stumbling, but filled with an emotion that made Margaret's own eyes well up. That night, Margaret emailed Professor Thomas. Something's changing with Eliza. I think she's finding that voice you mentioned. At their next lesson, Professor Thomas didn't start with their usual scales or the pieces Eliza had been assigned to practice. Instead, he simply said, play for me, whatever comes to mind. Eliza hesitated, her hands hovering above the keys. Playing her private improvisations for someone else felt like sharing a diary, but Professor Thomas waited patiently, his eyes kind. Finally, she began to play. The melody started softly, tentatively, like a question asked in whispers. It grew stronger, more confident, building towards something that felt like a release of long-held breath. There were mistakes, notes that clashed, rhythms that faltered, but the raw emotion of the piece was undeniable. When she finished, the room was silent, except for the lingering resonance of the final chord. Professor Thomas sat very still, his eyes closed. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. That, he said simply, is your voice. From that day forward, their lessons changed. Technical exercises were still important, and Eliza continued to study the great composers. But Professor Thomas now devoted part of each session to what he called musical conversation, pure improvisation, where Eliza could explore the feelings she couldn't express in words. Winter melted into spring, and spring bloomed into summer once more. Eliza turned 15. Her music evolved rapidly, becoming more complex, more personal. Professor Thomas began recording their sessions, giving Eliza the chance to listen back and refine her improvisations into proper compositions. You're not just a pianist anymore, he told her. You're a composer. One evening in late August, as they drove home from the community center, Aunt Margaret said casually, "Professor Thomas called me today. He thinks you should consider entering the Young Composers competition at the State University." Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. She grabbed her phone and typed furiously, "I don't want to perform in front of people." I know, Margaret said quickly. "But this isn't a performance competition. You'd submit a recorded piece. The judges never even see you." Eliza's fingers flew across her phone screen. "But if I won, wouldn't I have to go to an award ceremony or something?" Margaret glanced at her, then back at the road. "Well, yes, but Professor Thomas thinks your work deserves to be heard, Eliza, and I agree with him." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. The thought of strangers listening to her music, hearing the feelings she poured into the keys, the emotions she couldn't voice any other way, made her stomach twist with anxiety. But another part of her, a quiet part she'd barely acknowledged, whispered that maybe, just maybe, her music could reach people in ways she never could herself. The next morning, she slid a note across the breakfast table to Aunt Margaret. "I'll think about it." September brought a new school year, her first in high school. The building was bigger, the faces unfamiliar, the social dynamics even more complex than middle school had been. Eliza still carried her whiteboard, but used it less now, relying more on her phone to communicate when necessary. Most of her teachers knew about her from Mr. Rivera, who had prepared them for her silence. What they weren't prepared for was her music. When Eliza finally gathered the courage to visit the high school music room after classes one day, the new music teacher, Ms. Liu, happened to be working late. She looked up in surprise when Eliza entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. Eliza held up her phone with a note already typed. "I was wondering if I could use the piano sometimes." Ms. Liu smiled. "You must be Eliza. Mr. Rivera told me about you. He said you're quite talented." Eliza's cheeks warmed at the compliment. She typed again. "Would it be okay if I played now? Just for a few minutes?" "Of course," Ms. Liu said, gesturing to the piano. "I'd love to hear you play." The school's piano wasn't as magnificent as the grand at the community center, but it was well maintained and had a warm, mellow tone. Eliza sat down, took a deep breath, and began one of her own compositions, a piece she'd been refining for weeks. Ms. Liu was grading papers, but her pen soon stilled. She turned in her chair to watch Eliza, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine amazement. When Eliza finished, Ms. Liu set down her pen. "That was beautiful," she said. "I don't recognize it, though." "Who's the composer?" Eliza hesitated, then typed, "I am." Ms. Liu's eyes widened. "You wrote that? It's extraordinary." She paused, thinking. "Would you be interested in playing for the winter concert? We could record you beforehand if you're uncomfortable with a live audience." Eliza's immediate instinct was to refuse, but she remembered Professor Thomas's words about finding her voice, and Aunt Margaret's gentle encouragement to share her gift. She typed slowly, "Maybe I need to think about it." "Of course," Ms. Liu said. "No pressure. The offer stands whenever you're ready." That evening, Eliza made a decision. She would enter the Young Composers competition, not because she expected to win, but because it was time to let her music speak beyond the walls of practice rooms and private lessons. The piece she would submit was already forming in her mind, a composition about silence and sound, absence and presence, loss and love. She worked on it every day for weeks, refining, polishing, pouring everything she couldn't say into the notes. Professor Thomas helped her record it on his professional equipment, his eyes shining with pride as she played it through without a single mistake. "You've found it," he said when she finished. "Your voice." Eliza smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. The piece was called Unspoken, her first complete composition and in many ways the truest thing she'd ever said. October brought crisp air, falling leaves, and a letter from the State University. Aunt Margaret found it in their mailbox after work, the official university seal stamped on the envelope. Her heart raced as she carried it inside, finding Eliza at her keyboard, headphones on, lost in her musical world. Margaret gently touched her niece's shoulder. Eliza looked up, pulling off her headphones, then noticed the envelope in her aunt's hand. Her eyes widened. "It came," Margaret said, holding it out. Eliza stared at it, not reaching to take it. After submitting her composition to the Young Composers competition, She'd tried to forget about it, throwing herself into school and her regular practice routine. But in quiet moments before sleep came, her mind would drift to the judges listening to her music, hearing the pieces of her soul she'd stitched together with notes and rhythm. "Do you want me to open it?" Margaret asked gently. Eliza nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. Margaret carefully tore the envelope open and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes scanned the page, and then she looked up, her face breaking into a wide smile. "You won, Eliza," she said, her voice catching. "You won first place." The room seemed to tilt around Eliza. First place. Out of all the young composers who entered, students with years more experience, many who'd been composing since they could walk, they had chosen her piece. Her music. Her voice. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and typed, "Are you sure?" Margaret laughed, handing her the letter. "Read it yourself." The words blurred before Eliza's eyes, but there it was in black and white. "We are pleased to inform you that your composition Unspoken has been awarded first place in the junior division of this year's Young Composers Competition." The letter went on to explain that there would be an award ceremony in December, where her piece would be performed by university musicians. They requested her presence to accept the award. Eliza's momentary joy froze into fear. A ceremony, people watching her, expecting her to speak, expecting her to be normal. She typed frantically, "I can't go. They don't understand. I can't talk to them." Aunt Margaret sat beside her on the piano bench. "The letter says Professor Thomas already explained your situation. They don't expect you to give a speech, just to be there." Eliza's breathing came faster. Even without having to speak, the thought of standing on a stage with all those eyes on her made her chest tighten painfully. She shook her head hard. "I won't go," she typed. "They can mail the certificate." Margaret sighed, putting an arm around Eliza's thin shoulders. "Let's not decide right now. We have time to think about it." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She tossed in bed, her mind racing between pride in her accomplishment and terror at the thought of the ceremony. Around midnight, she got up and went to her keyboard, plugging in headphones so she wouldn't wake her aunt. As her fingers found the familiar keys, she began to play, not her winning composition or any piece she knew, but something new that poured out of the storm inside her. The notes were chaotic at first, mirroring her anxiety, but gradually found a pattern, a resolution. By the time she finished playing, her racing heart had calmed. In the music, she'd found an answer. The next morning, she showed Aunt Margaret a note. "I'll go to the ceremony, but I want to play my piece myself instead of having the university musicians do it." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked, surprised. "That would mean performing in front of everyone." Eliza nodded. She wasn't sure at all, but something told her this was the right path, terrifying as it might be. Professor Thomas was thrilled when they called him with the news. "This is perfect," he said. "Your music should be played by you. No one else can capture what you meant to say with it." The weeks leading up to the ceremony flew by in a blur of preparation. Eliza practiced her piece until she could play it in her sleep, refining tiny details, making it even more perfect than the recorded version she'd submitted. At school, Ms. Liu let her use the music room during lunch and after classes to practice on a real piano instead of her keyboard at home. Word of her accomplishment had spread through the small high school, and occasionally other students would linger by the music room door listening. Eliza pretended not to notice, but their presence made her more nervous about the upcoming performance. 2 weeks before the ceremony, disaster struck. Aunt Margaret, who had been fighting a persistent cough for days, collapsed while preparing dinner. Eliza found her on the kitchen floor, gasping for breath, her lips tinged blue. The next hours passed in a terrifying haze. The ambulance ride, the crowded emergency room, the doctors' serious faces as they spoke words Eliza barely understood. Pneumonia, respiratory distress, hospitalization. They kept Margaret overnight, then another night, and another. Oxygen tubes ran beneath her nose and IV lines snaked from her arms. She tried to smile reassuringly at Eliza during visits, but her face was gray with exhaustion, her voice a raspy whisper. "It's just a bad case of pneumonia," she told Eliza. "I'll be fine in a few days." But the days passed, and Margaret didn't come home. Eliza stayed with their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd been friends with Margaret for years. Mrs. Chen was kind, but didn't understand Eliza's silence the way Margaret did. Communication became a frustrating game of charades when Eliza's phone battery died and she couldn't find her charger. The piano sat untouched. The thought of playing, of preparing for the ceremony seemed impossibly trivial now. All Eliza could think about was her aunt in that hospital bed, looking smaller and frailer each day. The doctor said Margaret was stable but not improving as quickly as they'd hoped. One of them mentioned something about her immune system being compromised from stress and overwork. Guilt gnawed at Eliza. Had Margaret been pushing herself too hard all these years, caring for a child who wouldn't speak? A child whose silence made everything more complicated, more exhausting. One afternoon, while Margaret dozed in her hospital bed, Eliza wrote on her whiteboard, "This is my fault, isn't it?" Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She frowned at the message, then shook her head weakly. "No, little bird. Not at all. Just bad luck and a stubborn virus." Eliza erased the board and wrote again, "You work too hard because of me." Margaret reached for Eliza's hand, her grip weaker than usual but still warm. "I work hard because I love my job and I love you. That's life, Eliza. We all have challenges." She paused, catching her breath. "Your silence has never been a burden to me. Never." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks. She wanted so badly to believe her aunt. But the sight of Margaret in that hospital bed told a different story. Years of worry and stress had worn her down, made her vulnerable to illness. And now, with the competition ceremony just days away, Margaret was too sick to attend. That evening, Professor Thomas picked Eliza up from Mrs. Chen's house and drove her to the community center for her regular practice time. He'd been checking in daily since Margaret's hospitalization, doing what he could to maintain some normalcy in Eliza's life. "How is she today?" he asked as they drove. Eliza typed on her phone. "A little better. They might let her come home next week." "That's good news," Professor Thomas said, but his voice was cautious. "And how are you feeling about the ceremony?" "It's this Saturday." Eliza hadn't thought about it in days. Now she typed, "I'm not going." Professor Thomas glanced at her, then back at the road. "Because of your aunt? She won't be able to come, and I can't leave her alone." "She wouldn't be alone, Eliza. The hospital staff—" "No," Eliza typed, cutting him off. "I meant I can't go without her. I can't do it alone." They drove in silence for a while. When they reached the community center, Professor Thomas turned off the engine but didn't move to get out of the car. "Your aunt would want you to go," he said quietly. "You know that, don't you? She's so proud of what you've accomplished." Eliza stared out the window, blinking back tears. Of course Margaret would want her to go. Margaret always wanted Eliza to push beyond her comfort zone, to experience life fully despite her silence. But the thought of walking onto that stage alone, facing that crowd without Margaret's steady presence in the front row, was unthinkable. Inside the community center, Eliza sat at the grand piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. The piece she'd composed, unspoken, had won her the competition, but now the title felt like a cruel joke. There was so much still unspoken between her and Margaret, things she'd never found a way to express even through music. What if something happened to Margaret? What if her condition worsened? What if Eliza never got the chance to tell her, what? That she was grateful, that she was sorry, that she loved her more than anything in this world? Without conscious decision, Eliza began to play, not her competition piece, but something new that formed under her fingers like clay on a potter's wheel. It was a song about fear and gratitude, about silence that becomes a wall and music that breaks through it. She played until her fingers ached and tears blurred her vision. Professor Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, approached when she finally stopped. "That was beautiful," he said. "Is it a new composition?" Eliza nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. She reached for her phone and typed a message that surprised even herself. "I want to play this for my aunt. At the hospital." "Before the ceremony," Professor Thomas smiled. "I think that can be arranged. The hospital has a small chapel with a piano. It's not a grand like this one, but—" "It doesn't matter," Eliza typed. "I just need her to hear it." The next day, with special permission from Margaret's doctor, Eliza was allowed to play in the hospital chapel. An orderly wheeled Margaret's bed down to the small room, positioning it near the upright piano that had seen better days. "What's this about?" Margaret asked, her voice stronger than it had been in days.
Eliza didn't respond except to take her aunt's hand and squeeze it before sitting at the piano. Then she began to play the piece she'd composed the previous night, her heart speaking directly to the woman who had loved her through 12 years of silence. The hospital chapel was small and plain, with wooden pews and simple stained glass windows that cast colored light across the worn carpet. The piano tucked in the corner was nothing special, an old upright with yellowed keys and a bench that wobbled slightly. But as Eliza began to play, the humble room filled with something extraordinary. Aunt Margaret lay in her hospital bed, oxygen tubes still in her nose, her eyes fixed on her niece's back. The melody that emerged from the piano started softly, almost hesitantly like a question asked in whispers. Then it grew, finding strength and voice, becoming a conversation Eliza had never been able to have. The music spoke of gratitude, for 12 years of patience, for understanding silence, for never pushing too hard but never giving up. It spoke of fear, the terror of that rainy night long ago when her world had shattered and the newer fear of losing the only person who had held the broken pieces together. It spoke of love, deep and wordless and true. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She had always believed that Eliza would find her voice someday, though perhaps not in the way she'd expected. Here it was now, pouring from her niece's fingers, saying everything that needed to be said. When the final notes faded, the chapel was silent, except for the soft beeping of Margaret's heart monitor. Eliza turned on the bench, her face streaked with tears but somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "That was beautiful," Margaret whispered. "What's it called?" Eliza reached for her whiteboard and wrote a single word. "Thanks." Margaret's laugh turned into a cough, which she quickly controlled. "That doesn't seem grand enough for such a piece." Eliza erased the board and wrote again, "It's all I've wanted to say." Professor Thomas, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "Eliza, that was extraordinary. Even more powerful than your competition piece." He glanced at Margaret. "Your niece has a remarkable gift. She speaks through music more eloquently than most people do with words." Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "I've always known that." She reached out a hand, which Eliza took. "Have you decided about the ceremony?" The competition awards ceremony was just 2 days away. Eliza had been avoiding thinking about it, torn between her promise to attend and her reluctance to leave her aunt. She wrote on the board, "I can't leave you." "Don't be silly," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "You've worked too hard for this. I'm getting better and I'll be fine for a few hours while you go get your award. It won't feel right without you there." Margaret squeezed Eliza's hand. "Then take this with you." She reached up with her free hand and unclasped the silver locket she always wore around her neck, a family heirloom that had belonged to Eliza's grandmother. "I'll be with you." Eliza stared at the locket, then back at her aunt's face. Slowly, she nodded. The day of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, though cold enough for the first frost to dust the lawn outside Mrs. Chen's house, where Eliza was still staying. Professor Thomas picked her up early, giving them plenty of time to reach the university and rehearse on the concert hall piano. "Nervous?" he asked as they drove. Eliza nodded, clutching her aunt's locket, which now hung around her own neck. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing through all the things that could go wrong. What if she froze on stage? What if she forgot the notes? What if people stared at her, whispering about the strange silent girl? The concert hall was larger than she'd imagined, with rows of plush red seats facing a grand stage. On that stage sat a gleaming black concert grand piano, bigger and more imposing than even the one at the community center. Eliza approached it slowly, aware of Professor Thomas watching her. "Take your time," he said. "Get to know it." She sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, not yet playing, just feeling. Then she began her piece, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the piano responded to her touch. The acoustics in the hall were perfect, carrying the notes up to the high ceiling and back again, surrounding her with her own music. By the time she finished the rehearsal, some of her fear had faded. The piano felt like a friend now, a partner in the conversation she was about to have with the audience. As afternoon turned to evening, people began to arrive, music students, professors, parents, other competitors. Eliza waited in a small room backstage,
her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Professor Thomas came to check on her. "They're ready for you," he said. "You'll be the final performer of the evening after all the other awards are presented." Eliza nodded, standing on shaky legs. She straightened the dark blue dress Aunt Margaret had helped her pick out weeks ago, when the ceremony had seemed like a distant worry. The locket felt warm against her skin. From her seat in the front row, she watched as other young composers received their awards for second and third place. The program listed her only as E. Winters. Professor Thomas had arranged for her name not to be announced, knowing she wouldn't respond if called. Then it was time. The dean of the music department stepped up to the microphone. "Our first-place winner this year composed a piece that left our judges speechless," he said. "It's my honor to present this award for Unspoken, a work that speaks volumes despite its title." He held up a crystal trophy, looking expectantly at the front row. Professor Thomas gave Eliza a gentle nudge, and she rose to her feet, walking to the stage with small, careful steps. Taking the trophy, she managed a slight smile and nod before turning toward the piano. This was the part she'd been dreading and longing for all at once, playing her piece for this hall full of strangers. As she sat at the bench, adjusting it slightly, she caught a movement at the back of the hall. The heavy doors had opened and two figures were entering, an orderly pushing a wheelchair and in it Aunt Margaret. Eliza's hands froze above the keys. Margaret wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in the hospital recovering. Yet there she was, pale but smiling, wrapped in a heavy blanket despite the warmth of the hall. Their eyes met across the distance, and Margaret gave a small nod, as if to say, "I'm here." "You can do this." Something shifted inside Eliza then. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed shape, becoming something she could use rather than something that used her. She took a deep breath and began to play. The piece started as it always did, with the gentle questioning notes that had come to her months ago when she first began to find her composer's voice. But as she continued, something new emerged. Variations she hadn't planned, emotions she hadn't expressed before. The music became a living thing, evolving under her hands, telling not just the story of her silence, but of her journey to be heard. When the final chord faded, there was a moment of complete stillness in the hall. Then the audience erupted in applause, people rising to their feet, some wiping away tears. Eliza stood from the bench, her legs steadier now, and bowed as Professor Thomas had taught her. As the applause continued, she looked again to the back of the hall where her aunt sat in the wheelchair, clapping despite the IV still attached to her hand, her face shining with pride. In that moment, something broke open inside Eliza, a dam that had held back words for 12 years. Without planning it, without even realizing what she was doing, she stepped to the microphone. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from disuse but audible in the suddenly silent hall. The words felt strange in her mouth like foreign objects. "This is for my aunt." A gasp went up from those who knew her story. Professor Thomas, standing in the wings, put a hand over his mouth. And in her wheelchair at the back of the hall, Margaret began to cry, not the quiet tears of before, but deep, body-shaking sobs of joy. Eliza left the stage, walking not back to her seat but straight down the center aisle to where her aunt waited. When she reached her, Margaret pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You spoke," Margaret whispered against her hair. "I needed to," Eliza whispered back, her voice scratchy but growing stronger with each word. "Just once. To say thank you. Will you speak again?" Margaret asked, pulling back to look at her niece's face. Eliza considered this, then gave a small smile. "Sometimes," she said, "when words are better than music." Later that night, back in the hospital where doctors had reluctantly agreed Margaret could stay, rather than returning to Mrs. Chen's house, Eliza sat beside her aunt's bed. The crystal trophy caught the dim light from the bedside lamp. "Are you glad you went?" Margaret asked. Eliza nodded, then said aloud, "Yes." The words still felt strange, but less so than before. "And your voice?" Margaret asked gently. "How does it feel to use it again?" Eliza thought for a long moment. "Like finding something I didn't know I'd lost," she said slowly. "But I think I'll still need the piano." "Some things are too big for words." Margaret smiled, her eyes drifting closed as fatigue overtook her. "That's true for all of us, little bird. That's why we have music in the first place. As her aunt slept, Eliza looked out the hospital window at the night sky. For 12 years, she had been the girl who remained hushed, locked in a silence of her own making. The piano had given her a voice when words failed her, had let her scream and weep and laugh and love through music when her throat could produce no sound. Now she had two voices, one made of words, fragile and new, and one made of music, strong and sure. Together they would tell her story moving forward. She thought of all the compositions waiting inside her, all the feelings still to express.